Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of me talking about things that I learned in my Introductory to Psychology class. For those who had a vested interest in the soup that I was discussing in my previous video, it ended up being delicious. Probably could have gone a little bit heavier on the mint leaves, but that's all part of the learning experience in the world of cooking. Speaking of learning experiences, today we're going to be talking about motivation, emotions, and personality. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff in these two chapters that are combined, so let's jump right on in. The first thing that we're going to be talking about today is motivation, and like always, it's best to start with just defining it. We learned in class that motivation is a state of being that causes us to experience a drive to go do something. It's like a feeling that we get that motivates us to get up and go get some food, or go write a song, or go do whatever it is that you feel motivated to do. We learned in class that there are essentially two different types of motivations, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But first, let's take a look at this pyramid here to learn about some of the things that might motivate us. This is what's known as Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist that believed motivation kind of works in different stages based off of what we need as human beings. And in Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs here, at the very bottom, the most basic need, he labeled as our physiological needs. This may motivate us to get up and eat, to get up and have a drink of water. These are the motivations that satisfy our most basic needs for survival. And kind of right above that is safety needs, which sort of falls under survival too. This is essentially the concept of doing things so you can get shelter, going to work so you can buy clothes because we need clothes to survive, stuff like that. Further up the pyramid is love and belonging. Maslow states that since we are social creatures, we need interaction, we need to socialize with other human beings, and this is why we may feel motivated to go out and make some friends, maintain contact with family members, and just be part of different social groups. And then once all of those three needs are met, your physiological, your safety, your sense of love and belonging, we move up to our esteem needs. This involves the act of doing things so you can get recognition and prestige and increase status among family members, peers, coworkers. And at the very top here is self-actualization. Once all of these other different needs are met, we can begin to work towards self-actualization. We'll talk a little bit about what that is in a minute, but just to get the general idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom, your physiological needs, above that, safety, then love and belonging, your esteem needs, and then self-actualization. Okay, so now that we talked about the different things that may be motivating us in this little pyramid here, let's go ahead and discuss the two different main types of motivation. We learned they are extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic, with this prefix here of ex, signals that there are some outside forces at work. Extrinsic motivation is all about outside factors that are motivating you to go do something. For example, you want to go out and make some food because the reward is food and that satisfies your hunger. You want to go out and make some friends because you get the external reward of socializing. You want to study for a test because you get the reward of getting a good grade, and maybe you get some candy or something if you do really well on an exam. These are all different external factors that may cause extrinsic motivation. On the other hand, intrinsic motivation is a type of motivation that doesn't involve any sort of external reward or things that are given to you from the outside. Intrinsic motivation is more about just doing something because you find an inherent value or pleasure in the act itself. And if we're trying to see where this fits in on the pyramid, I would say that intrinsic motivation maybe belongs more just in the esteem or the self-actualization category. It's good to feel recognized and seen by your peers if you're doing good work, but you also may want to do good work and, achieve what you can just because it feels good to do that. And that kind of plays a role in this concept of self-actualization too. Self-actualization is all about reaching your fullest potentials, being the best version of yourself that you can be. If you are working towards self-actualization, you're not doing that because other people are telling you to. You're doing it because you feel some satisfaction in knowing that you are doing everything you can to get the most out of your experience here on Earth. Okay, so that was a nice little introduction to motivation. Let's take a peek at emotions now, because emotions can play a very significant role in our motivations too. So when we talk about emotions, emotions are feelings we experience that have physiological, behavioral, and cognitive components to them. Now, what does that mean? What does that look like? Let's take an emotion, for example, like anger. Let's say that you're angry, perhaps, that the Chicago Police Department murdered a 13-year-old, a child. At the physiological level, this activates your sympathetic nervous system, which is a part of the larger autonomic nervous system, and this spends stored energy in your body, which is why when you feel angry, you may feel your heart rate increasing and you just feel very physically charged. At the behavioral level, this triggers your fight or flight response, meaning when you're confronted with a problem, you're either going to choose to fight it, confront it, tackle it head on, or you'll choose flight and run away. Now, anger is typically associated with the fight response because at the cognitive level, anger is associated with thoughts and feelings of frustration that somebody or perhaps a larger group of people is being wronged or being denied rights of some kind. And this is what causes you to want to fight to restore some justice. Now remember, when we talk about fighting, that can look like a lot of different things. Fighting does not necessarily have to be a violent thing. Happiness, on the flip side, is another emotion that can drive behavior. If you want to be happy, this can serve as an intrinsic motivation because you can do things to make yourself happy, not because you're getting an external reward, you're not getting food, you're not getting praise from somebody else, you're not gaining shelter, you're just doing something because you find value or pleasure in the act itself, and this would be an example of intrinsic motivation. Alright, now that we've learned a little bit about motivation and a little bit about emotions, let's talk about personality, because this is sort of an all-encompassing concept here. Personality is generally defined as a relatively stable pattern of emotions, motivations, and behaviors that are unique to each individual person. Now, different fields of psychology approach personality and interpret it in different ways. We spent a lot of time in our class talking about personality from the psychodynamic perspective, which has a lot of ideas that were sort of invented by Sigmund Freud. And one of Freud's concepts of personality involves three different structures known as the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is essentially a bunch of unconscious and instinctive primal desires. It just wants to feel good without any regard for the rules of the societies that we live in. It just wants to hit the pleasure button over and over again, which is why it's often referred to as the pleasure principle, which, by the way, is a great album by Gary Newman. You should check it out sometime when you get the chance. We'll skip the ego for now and come back to this one in a minute, and jump down to the superego, because the superego is essentially the exact opposite of the id. The superego knows that the person in the personality wants to feel good, but the superego tries to maintain a sort of idealized version of oneself that has all the right behaviors, does and says all the right thing. Now, the ego kind of comes in and acts as a mediator between the id and the superego. While the id just wants to feel good all the time, the superego just wants to be good all the time. The ego kind of finds a way to balance some of the primal desires of the id with the behavioral desires of the superego, and it finds ways to feel good while still acting within the rules of society so you can still be a good person as well. Now, one aspect of personality that was mentioned briefly in class and in our readings too is the idea of the self. And this is another aspect of personality that has been looked at from many different angles, and there's a lot of different perspectives on it. The one that I thought was most interesting came from the humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers. And he believed that the self is the ever-evolving sense of who and what we are and how we respond to the environment around us. And he believed that there were two critical elements that kind of compose the different elements of the self, and those are our self-concept and self-esteem. Our self-concept is all about how we view ourselves and our own adequacy. Like personality, this is unique to each person, because every person on Earth sees themselves and the world in totally different and unique ways. And we also have different values, and we place varying levels of importance on different dimensions of life, like success and failure, adequacy and inadequacy, decency and indecency, so on. Self-esteem, on the other hand, is kind of like self-respect. It is our confidence in our own worth as human beings. And this is very important in childhood development because parents can help children develop a high sense of self-esteem by showing them what Carl Rogers referred to as unconditional positive regard. And this is essentially saying that regardless of what a child does or says, they still get a sort of love and acceptance and feel like they have an inherent worth as a human being. Now, this doesn't mean if a child is misbehaving, you just let them do whatever they want. It more just means no matter what they do, the child knows that they're still going to get that love and acceptance. Now, where some people run into trouble is when their parents show them what's known as conditional positive regard, meaning the child only gets that love and acceptance if they act or behave in a certain way. They have to fit a certain type of mold to receive that love and acceptance. And so if a child starts growing up and realizing that their sense of self does not adhere to whatever that mold is supposed to be, it may cause them to repress different parts of themselves. And this can lead to a distorted sense of self where they feel like they have to learn to hate or disown parts of themselves that they should actually be embracing and loving as part of who they are. Well, that's all we learned in chapters 8 and 10 this week on motivations, emotions, and personality. I know different concepts like the self can be a little bit abstract and difficult to understand at times. I learn more and more about who I am as a person every single day. If that's something that you struggle with a little bit too, try taking a few moments each day to take a peek at the clouds or watch the sunset for a while. Think about what you're doing right now and what you would like to be doing. What do you want your relationship with the world to be like? You have the power to make that happen. Do you understand? You have the power. Next week we'll be talking about chapter 9 in our book, which is all about childhood development. I'll probably be taking an entire course on that subject at some point, but since this is still Introduction to Psychology, I'll do my best to summarize what we learned in a little video just like this one. I'll see you next time, everybody.